listeners, welcome to today's session. Today we are going to talk about land, environment and sustainable livelihood. As you must have known by now that land and environment form the important part of tribal life in India. They are essential for the sustenance of tribal livelihood system, and not only that, most tribals make their livelihood security on a combination of forest gathering and agriculture labor. Within this broader framework, this session aims to achieve following objectives. Number one, to understand the meaning of sustainable livelihood in terms of tribal society in India. You will be able to explore the relationship between land and livelihoods of tribals. Then, this session will also examine the role of environment in sustaining tribal livelihood, and you would know the contribution of forest towards the sustainability of tribal livelihood. This session will also try to explore the relationship between land, forest and tribal identity in India. Developing countries tend to be more dependent on natural resources as their primary source of income, and many individuals depend on these resources for their livelihoods. It is estimated that half of the world's population remains directly tied to local natural resources, and many rural communities depend upon agriculture, fisheries, minerals, and timber as their main sources of income. The tribals are now demanding that the centrality of their livelihood, such as land and forest, be recognized and ensured, and the Rights Act of 2006 is the product of such a consistent demand. There is a close proximity between land, environment, and tribal society in India. Land and environment based resources are central to the social and cultural life of the tribal society. They play an important role in the dynamics of tribal society. And land and environment based resources are central to the livelihood of the tribal society. In India, the livelihood and survival of tribals largely rest on their access to land and forests. The livelihood pattern of the tribals in India depends on the extraction of the natural resources such as land, forest and water. Now when we try and understand the sustainable livelihood, what does exactly it means? So before understanding sustainable livelihood, it is crucial to look at the conceptualization of livelihood. Livelihood is the material basis on which life is sustained. It is a multidimensional concept which embraces all forces and constraints, material and non-material, that determines a family's existence. It does not mean only the activities people carry out to earn their living, but also includes a variety of elements that contribute to or affect their ability to ensure certain economic activities for their upkeep. To put it differently, livelihood is not restricted to certain specified income generating activities carried out by the tribal communities in India, but also covers a number of elements that help them to perform their economic activities more perfectly. In short, livelihood comprises of the resources, that is natural, physical, human, financial, social and political, the activities and the access to these mediated by institutions and social relations that together determine the living gained by the individual or household. And this was talked about by Ellis in the year 2000. So the term livelihood can be defined as a means of gaining living or a combination of the resources used and the activities undertaken by individuals, households and communities in order to live. In the age of liberalization, privatization and globalization, that is LPG, the issue of sustainable livelihood assumes great significance for tribal communities in India. As this is the age of population migration, and with increasing population on the scarcely available resources, Sustainable natural resources necessarily involves making livelihood more sustainable. Since 1990s, what worries tribal communities much more is the rapid deterioration of sustainable livelihood. A livelihood is sustainable when it can cope with and recover from stress and shocks, maintain or enhance its capabilities and assets without undermining the natural resource base. Sustainable livelihood can be defined as a means of living or of supporting life and meeting individuals and community needs. It is basically the material basis on which life is sustained. It provides new perspectives on developing healthy, sustainable societies that provide people with secure and satisfying livelihoods. The sustainable livelihood approach focuses on the way to improve understanding of the livelihood of the poor. It draws on the main factors that affect poor people's livelihood and the typical relationships between these social, economic, and political factors. It can be used in planning new development activities and in assessing the contribution that existing activities have made to sustaining livelihoods. The rights of tribals to livelihood recognize the symbiotic relationship between them and the natural resources and the centrality of natural resources for livelihood. It includes right to food, right to water, then right to work, right to forests, right to land. Sustainable livelihood aims to promote equity between and among generations, race, gender, and ethnic groups, in the access to and distribution of wealth and resources, in the sharing of productive and reproductive roles, and the transfer of knowledge and skills. It nurtures a sense of place and connection to the local community and adapt to and restore regional ecosystems. Based production on renewable energy and on regenerating local resource endowments while reducing intensity of energy use, then eliminating overconsumption of local and global resources and assuring no net loss of biodiversity. Utilize appropriate technology that is ecologically fitting, socially just and humane, and that enhances rather than displaces community knowledge and skills. Reduce as much as possible travel to workplace and the distance between producers and users. These principles encompass a holistic set of values that are non-exploitative, promote participation in decision making, emphasize the quality and creative nature of work, then it place needs over wants and foster healthy, mutually beneficial relationships among people and between people and their environment. Sustainable livelihood is supported by the state through formulating and implementing different policies. It adopts political, economic, and social policies based on socio-economic goals in general and the sustainability of livelihood for tribals in particular. Today, the livelihood system of the tribals has been affected by a number of factors. First is disruption of livelihood security with resultant non-sustainable livelihood can come about in several ways. Natural calamities such as drought and flood can destroy livelihood, and it can take a long time before livelihood can be put back on a sustainable basis. Then inability of non-food producers in agriculture to find a market for their produce. Then inadequacy of household income to meet minimum consumption requirements on a continuous basis, and mismatch between sustainable yields of a natural resource and given certain institutional and technological conditions, the ability of a population dependent on such a resource to collect enough of it. Now let us talk about land and sustainable livelihood. Traditionally, agriculture has been the single largest source of livelihoods. for almost half of the population. Land is a major economic aspect in any agricultural society for that matter. In India, more than 70% of the rural people depend on agriculture for their subsistence economy, and large numbers of tribal people live in rural areas. This notion reflects the deep relationship between tribals and land, and the relationship is intact. According to the National Tribal Policy, over 80% of scheduled tribes work in the primary sector against 53% of the general population. Tribal economies continue to be centered around land and other land-based resources. Even today, land continues to be the mainstay of around 90% of the tribal population, and thus is the only tangible productive asset which the tribal communities possess. Land-based opportunities are crucial for improving economic status of scheduled tribes in India. And land is not only a source of livelihood for tribals, but it is also connected with their sense of history and is a symbol of social prestige for them. For instance, ownership of land gives people social dignity, then economic viability and sense of security. On the other hand, landlessness erodes social status and makes people economically vulnerable and mentally insecure. In tribal society, land is always associated with social status and corresponds to the idea of power relationship, and the individuals with large amount of land play more influential role than the landless people. To put it differently, land not only plays a crucial role in defining the social status of the individual, but also influences the power structure of the tribal society to a great extent. Land is not merely an economic significance as a survival resource, it is also a social, the basis of a person's sense of belonging to a specific cultural community. Then cultural, that is a link of traditions, ethos and way of life. And political significance, that is the material basis for the power of the elder to manage the community. In other words, land is the basis of the polity, economy and culture of the tribal people. The tribal and land relationship can best be demonstrated by looking at the position of the International Work Group for Indigenous Affairs. Exploring the role of land in tribal life, the Government of India has adopted a number of important steps related to tribal rights on land. Within the backdrop, land reform was one of the important possible alternatives to address the rural inequalities in terms of land holding structure. The main objective of the land reform was to economic growth and human face. In other words, the land reform initiative of the state was to accelerate the economic growth of the country within the broader framework of bringing equality and justice to the weaker sections of the society, especially the scheduled tribes. Looking at the constitutional provisions, 5th and 6th schedules protect the tribal rights on land. Clause 5th of the 5th schedule of the constitution specifically provides that the governor of the states having areas under the 5th schedule may make regulations to prohibit or restrict the transfer of land by or among members of the scheduled tribes in such area, then regulate the allotment of land to members of the scheduled tribes in such area, and regulate the carrying on of business as money lender by persons who lend money to members of the scheduled tribes in such area. In the Northeast India, the 6th schedule of the constitution authorizes the autonomous district councils to make appropriate laws against land alienation, subject to approval by the governor. In addition, as the land is a state subject, the different states have been empowered to enact and implement different legal measures to protect and restore the tribal lands. There are several important legislations adopted by different states to prohibit transfer of tribal land to non-tribals. The Supreme Court of India justified the necessity of special legislations to protect the tribal rights on land in its holistic judgment of the Maharashtra Restoration of Lands to Scheduled Tribes Act on December 4, 1984. The Government of India has also established a number of working groups to examine the issues relating to alienation of tribal lands, including involuntary displacement of tribals from their habitats and livelihood for development purposes, and to suggest realistic measures for restoration of such lands to them and for economically viable and culturally acceptable resettlement of projected affected tribals. Despite the existence of overwhelming legislations to protect tribal rights on land, the marginalization of tribals in terms of land holding is more vocally visible in different corners of the country. Alienation of tribal land is the single most important cause of pauperization of tribals, rendering their vulnerable economic situation more precarious. The tribal land alienation has emerged as a major problem because of the adverse impact of modern development and commercialization of agriculture. The beginning of the process of land alienation is attributed to the introduction of the private property rights during British rule. This process is accelerated with the transfer of large chunk of tribal land to non-tribals and state-caused displacement from their means of livelihood. More than 50% of the persons displaced due to mines and mining projects are tribals. Despite the presence of different protective legislations, the dispossession of land by tribals in increasing over the period and the existing legislations have failed to protect one of the important means of tribal livelihood, that is the land. Environment and sustainable livelihood. When we talk about environment and sustainable livelihood, over the centuries, tribals have learned to live in harmony with nature. Tribals always depend on natural resources for the sustenance of their livelihood, such as land, water, and forest. With the increasing of population and high pressure on natural resources, the environment is degrading over the period. In this context, sustainable natural resource management necessarily involves making livelihood more sustainable. The tribals believe that the government has created, the environment has created to people's need, and they in turn, through various measures such as customs regulating distribution, then cultural traditions, religious myths and beliefs, and other forms of social control, save the environment and ensure that their needs are met, and simultaneously the environment is not destroyed. Thus, through judicious utilization of natural resources, the appropriate equilibrium between resource availability and human needs is maintained. The sustainable livelihood of tribals mainly depends on the utilization of natural resources, especially land and forest. When we talk about forest as a livelihood resource, what we realize is, according to the National Tribal Policy, about 60.4% of the 63% forest cover of the country and 63% of the dense forests lie in 187 tribal districts. Though the geographical area of these districts is just 33.6% of the country's geographical area, the tribal socio-cultural and economic life is intimately connected with the forest ecology. There has been a close relationship between forest and tribals since time immemorial. The historical association with forests through the ages made them lord of the forest, and in the Indian context, we have also coined the term Vanyajati, that is forest dwelling communities, Vanabasi, inhabitants of forests, or Vanaputra, that is forest dwellers for them. The forest constitutes the most important means of tribal livelihood system. for various reasons. The tribals depend on forest for a major part of their livelihood and have cultural links with the forest. They have a strong sense of attachment to the forest as their ancestral territory. The relationship between tribals and forest is termed as symbiotic because the survival of the people are dependent on the people for its preservation. The economic, cultural, and social life of these communities was fully intertwined with the forest. They were fully using forest resource as totems which reflect their collective sentiments and solidarity. The forest provided them not only with their basic requirements of food, fuel and fodder and fertilizer, but also their recreational, religious, social and cultural needs. All these needs were met by their immediate surroundings. The forest dweller developed vested interest in its preservation. In tribal areas, the food availability and consumption pattern depend upon natural resources. Any discussion of forest ecology and forest laws need to be centered around the fact that the tribal society here is critically dependent on forests. The nature and the degree of this dependence varies across the region and with time as various alternate options become available. So the forest dependence and dwelling, hilly and inaccessible terrain, pre-agricultural production systems mark the general livelihood patterns of the tribals in the country. With this, we will halt here for the next session. We will continue the discussion in the next session. Till then, you can keep watching the videos. You can watch the video again to have a better understanding. Bye, take care, and thank you.